The work of the Genome Center is to take the genomic research that we are working on here together with collaborators around New York and throughout the country and the world and translate that research into clinical solutions for human disease. We host events like this on a regular basis for the community to talk about important topics in genomics. And what's more important than whether or not we can live forever one day? And that's something that our esteemed guests will talk to us about tonight. We are delighted to have Dr. Nir Barzilai, an aging expert who runs the Institute for Aging at the Albert Einstein College of Medicine. And also our very good friend here at the Genome Center, CBS News medical correspondent Dr. Max Gomez, who is here on the eve of the publication of his new book, which is called Cells Are the New Cure, the Cutting-Edge Medical Breakthroughs That Are Transforming Health. So Max is here tonight, Dr. Max is here tonight to talk to you more about that. And I also wanted to extend, although regrettably she's unable to be here tonight, but our generous benefactress, Wesley Janeway, who underwrites these important lectures for us. So thank you for being here. We'll have a lovely evening planned for us. After the talk, some questions and answers, and then please stay with us for some cocktails and hors d'oeuvres following in the cafe to our right.
Yeah, that cocktail part is how we keep you here through the entire presentation. You're not fooling me for a minute. All right, so we're here tonight to talk about something I think most of us are interested in, aging, or maybe more accurately, anti-aging, right? Who here wants to live to be 100? 110? Oh, you're lying to me. All right, I'm not talking about 100 the way most of us usually think of 100, right? You're probably thinking wearing diapers in a wheelchair, not able to move around much, chew your food, you've got to gum your food and you don't remember your own name, never mind the name of your kids. It'll be much better than that, and that's what we're going to tell you about tonight, and that's what Nir is working on. It's going to be a lot better than that. Aging, as you can imagine, is complicated, right? There are many factors at play that eventually lead to what we call old age, but pretty much all of them are things that happen at the cellular level. And likewise, anti-aging strategies tend to focus on repairing cells, right? Getting rid of old cells is another approach, because as it turns out, keeping old senescent cells around that are done dividing isn't all that great for our health. Those old cells aren't just inert, they continue to produce a mix of chemicals, including pro-inflammatory cytokines are called, or hormones, that damage adjacent cells and lead to chronic inflammation. And if there's one thing that we're starting to learn recently is that inflammation is kind of at the heart of almost all of the diseases that lead to or end up killing us in the long run. They're at the root of most age-related diseases, from cancer to heart disease to perhaps even Alzheimer's, we heard last night. Now, there are many aspects to aging, and we won't be able to cover them all tonight, of course. But let me start by laying out an interesting approach that focuses on a research project that our panelist here, Nir, is intimately involved with. As the basis for some of this discussion, just as a slight aside here, when that Human Genome Project was elaborated, and then it came to be in the 90s, the cost there to sequence that one human genome was somewhere, I think, between $2.5 and $3 billion. Today, we can sequence an entire human genome for the cost of a fancy expense account dinner at some of these restaurants here in New York, a few $1,000s at most, and that price keeps going down dramatically, almost day by day. It's being done right upstairs here somewhere, as I believe. So, let me reiterate, the goal here is not to extend lifespan, but to extend health span. Again, because no one wants to live to be 100 and be senile and infirm for the last 20 or 30 years of their life. Plus, if we all live to 100 and we're sick for the last 10 or 20 years, that would be a catastrophe for society. We'd go broke trying to pay for all of those healthcare and nursing home bills. And interestingly, studies of many centenarians, like the large cohort that Dr. Barzilai is following up at Einstein in the Bronx, finds that they die, by the way, of the same diseases as non-centenarians. The big difference is that they stay relatively healthy and active right up until the end, and they get sick and die in a short period of time. In other words, their period of infirmity is pretty short, which is really kind of what you want if we're going to extend lifespan and, more importantly though, health span. You want that period of infirmity to be relatively short, and then it's over, right? So, you're not here to listen to me. Let's get started and listen to Dr. Barzilai and what he has to say here. Dr. Nir Barzilai, Director of the Institute for Aging Research at the Albert Einstein College of Medicine. Nir, come on up. Nir, let's start out with, because it seems like it should be obvious, but there are different opinions on what exactly is aging. It's not just getting older, it's not just going through some more calendar years. They're kind of different definitions of aging.
Max, didn't we agree that you're not going to ask this question?
No, we didn't.
Because
I'm a journalist, I can ask whatever I want.
You know, the way for me not to bore you with technicalities is to tell you about this couple in Midwest United States, elderly couple, and the wife turns to the husband and she says, honey, why don't we go upstairs and make love? And the husband looks at her and says, sweetie, I cannot do both. Okay? That's the definition of aging. By the way, I'm aware of the fact that here in New York, probably most of you are living in an apartment, so your functional capacity is really better. But you know, I think we know what's aging, and I think that what we're afraid most of aging is the diseases. It's the being sick part. It's the fact that you can be sick for a long period of time. It's the fact that after the age of 60, you're likely to get one disease and the treatment, and then a second disease and another treatment, and then a third disease. And it's accelerating the amounts of diseases we can really encounter, and the treatments, and the side effects of the treatment, and the combination of the treatments. And this is now failing us. This is not a good medical plan. We have to find something else to increase the health span.
So to extend lifespan or health span, is it just disease prevention or better treatments for these diseases?
Well, so look, for each one of the disease that you care of, okay, cardiovascular disease, cancer, diabetes, Alzheimer, the major risk factor, which people don't really appreciate, is aging. Okay, when the death of cardiovascular disease, when you go from 30 to 80, is 1,000-folds, okay, for cardiovascular disease. Now you'll say, just a minute, cholesterol is the major risk for heart disease. But no, cholesterol is the 3-fold risk for heart disease. Aging is the major risk for heart disease.
Aging is also for cancer.
Aging is a major risk for cancer. It's a major risk for Alzheimer's. So the point is, if we could target aging, okay, we can prevent not one disease, but several diseases. What happens if you get a heart attack and you go to the next hospital here? You'll get a bypass or a stent, okay? And what happens 2 years later, now that you survive heart disease? You get cancer, Alzheimer, or diabetes, because we never treated the aging, we just treated locally the heart.
True. So we've been successful at extending lifespan in a number of organisms, right? I mean, I know we can do it in rats, you said in worms, there's a variety of organisms. Why not in humans, though?
Well, first of all, we have extended lifespan in humans. You know, humans' lifespan was like 35 pretty much for thousands of years now. Started going up in the 1900s and started going, you know, really very nicely. So now life expectancy is 80 years old. So it's not that we failed, but what we did in this process, we treated infectious disease, and we did surgery that we couldn't do before. We did a lot of really good things, but we got stuck with the fact that we age. We got stuck with the fact that we age at different rates, okay? Some of us think of, I mean, all the people here are looking younger than their ages. But think of your friends. Some of them look 10 years older and some of them look 10 years younger, right? So we have this biology that is individual, and we have to find a way of how to do it. Okay, but I'm not answering your question actually.
For example, if you take a rat and half starve it, put it on caloric restriction, it lives much longer, right?
Right.
Or does it just seem like it lives longer? if we
Well,
starve
it would
ourselves?
seem that way for me. That's why I wanted to go to eat something first. But yeah, we've been extending lifespan in animals, and I think the point that's very important to remember, in particular if you have interest in cancer and how difficult it is with cancer, because you have your genome and the genome of the cancer, and this genome of the cancer is different than any other cancer, etc., etc. But with aging, it's very different. It's a process that's evolutionary conserved. So mice and rats and dogs and monkeys, they age like us, the same thing. The hair, the skin, the diseases, it's a variety of other diseases, but it's the same process. And that's why we're much more optimistic than the people with cancer. Because we give drugs, the drugs that we know are delaying aging, you can give to every animal and it'll delay in every animal this process. So it's going to work.
Okay, I got it. So
it's in your book, I thought.
have you met my agent over here? So let's go back to the centenarians that we looked at. It sounds like, they don't take care of, they haven't taken care of themselves. So a lot of people think I'm either going to live to 100 or I'm not, and kind of anything I do isn't going to make that much of a difference, because clearly these folks haven't been taking care of themselves and they're living to 100. So, why try? I might as well eat, steak and Haagen-Dazs every night.
Okay, so of course the answer is no, and I'll tell you that one day I was like on television and somebody got me, I was stopping at Starbucks and somebody stopped me and said, "You changed my life." I said, "Why?" He said, "Aren't you the guy who was on television just an hour ago?" I said, "Yes." He said, "I was at the gym and I listened to you and I realized my grandmother is 100 years old. I don't need to exercise anymore." Right? Of course, that's not the thing. That's only 1 out of 10,000 is 100 years old, is a healthy 100 years old. So we're unlikely to be 100 years old. And of course, that for the rest of us, first of all, the interaction with the environment is most important. And I'll tell you from an aging perspective, if you ask me one thing, it's exercise. One thing is exercise. At every age, in every form, exercise is number one anti-aging.
And when you say, because I want to make sure that we're clear, I was with the Alzheimer's Association, or Caring Kind, last night, and we talked about this interaction with the environment. By that you mean these social interactions, no? That you're really engaged with people and with friends, and not just the environment, meaning clean air, but it's that social interaction that seems to make a difference?
Well, that too. But I don't feel it in my heart for a simple reason. Most of our centenarians have lost their friends,
of course,
okay, 40, 50 years before. In fact, some of them said, we lost the children of our friends now, And so they are in many times in some form of isolation or relative isolation. The family still take care of them. So that's the story of centenarians, but I totally agree that environment has to do with food, with exercise, with following what the doctor says, and with social.
And just to pick up on that a little bit, some years ago I did a series of stories that we called Earth's Elders on super centenarians, 110 and older. And I interviewed two women, one in Mississippi, the other one in Alabama. They were 115 at the time. And one of the things I was trying to figure out is what did they have in common, these super centenarians, that allowed them to get that in? So, and correct me if I'm wrong, because, again, not many of them were obese. Most of them had led some kind of an active life. But the one that seemed very common thread through all of it is they had some sort of resilience up here. As you said, they buried their children, they buried their husband or husbands. Most of their friends were gone. If you're 115 years old, there's nobody that's your contemporary at that point. They'd seen wars, they'd lost friends, and they weren't just glasses half full. They were like, well, no, the glass is half full, and I'm going to just keep going.
So first of all, the concept of resiliency is right. I think aging is really to increase the resiliency. Okay, the resiliency to insult, to the resiliency of the fact that you're aging. How do you repair? It's a resiliency thing. But as for the personality part, I just want to tell you this anecdote. So I met a 104-year-old gentleman. And by the way, we published about their personality. They're outgoing, they are optimistic, everything that's nice. And I'm sitting with this guy, and he's like incredible. You would love him, He's just so nice. He has nothing bad to say about anyone, and he tells you about his life. And I was really moved sitting with him. And then I go out of the room, and I see his son, who's 82 years old. And I tell the son what I just told you. I said, your father is just the loveliest person. And he looks in my eyes and he says, you should have seen the son of a bitch when he was my age. He was terrible, okay? And then you realize when our social scientists or psychologists are talking about personality that doesn't change, it's mostly reflecting people who some of them got to the age of 70. But actually, between 70 and 100, personality change. And I'll tell you how it changed, because researchers at University of Pennsylvania did this cool study. They took young and old people, younger and older people like you, and they showed them slides. Half of the slides were good, like islands in Hawaii. And half of the slides were terrible, like a pizza with cockroaches on top. And they asked everybody to recall. So of course the young people recalled more and recalled equally from both. The older one...
From good and bad.
From good and bad. The older one recalled less, but mainly the good. By the way, I'm looking forward this period of my life. But it shows you there's things that will change in aging, even in people who are resilient. And I cannot say now that the fact that they are so great now, it's what got them there. I think they're two independent processes.
That's interesting. They evolved over the years. So it sounds like a lot of your centenarians, though, hit the genetic lottery. They have some sort of gene mutation, as we were talking, that protects them from some of the ravages of old age, or protects them or allows them to repair it. So what is that? And is there a way that we can get that?
So let me just tell you that we had two hypotheses. Okay, one hypothesis is, 1 out of 10,000 just have the perfect genome. They just don't have all those SNPs that are associated with cancer and diabetes and Alzheimer's. Okay, so that was one hypothesis, and we put it to rest very quickly. We did, at the time that was more expensive, we did our 44 whole genome sequencing of centenarians. And we went to this database that is called CleanVar, that had all the 15,000 mutations that if you have any one of them, you're most probably going to get a disease. Okay, 44 centenarians. We found in 44 centenarians over 250 mutations that should have made them sick. And they didn't have any one of those diseases. Now, I'll give you an example, just that you don't think that who knows what it is, but ApoE4, which is a risk factor for Alzheimer's, the textbooks will tell you that you're demented at 70 and you're dead at 80. There are two people who are 100 years old and they're not demented and they have those mutations. So just to explain that they don't have the perfect genome. They happen to have mutations that are slowing their aging process. So I'll give examples. And I'm giving you two examples for a very important reason. And that is that the point here is, so what if 1 out of 1,000 have genetics and we don't? But when we find what are those mutations, they are subject for drug development. And so 2 mutations that I'm going to tell you have been developed into drug. And one of them was published in New England Journal just 2 weeks ago. It's a CTP inhibitor. So we have 2 genes that I'm just throwing their names. I'm not explaining. One is CTP and one is ApoC3. And we have increase in functional mutations in those genes in centenarians. The reason it caught the eye of drug companies is not because they're interested in aging. We'll get there, right? It's not because they're interested in aging, but they said, just a minute. We are thinking of developing drugs against those pathways. Now, if they're actually humans that live with those mutations naturally, and they get to be 100, then that means the safety is going to be pretty good. If we don't screw up the drug itself, then the mechanism is pretty good. So one is a CTP inhibitor that Merck developed, and they just showed that it delays prevents cardiovascular disease. The other is the ApoC3 inhibitor, is an antibody that's developed. I blocked the name because it was ISIS until ISIS came in, the company. I don't know if anybody knows what it is now. I don't remember, but they're developing that, and they also had a New England Journal with that. So just to tell you that the genetic is relevant, okay? That's how we learn, and that's how we'll develop drugs. So those are 2 examples of lipid genes. The other thing is, and that's in nature. In nature, the dwarf live longer. So the small dogs live longer, the ponies live longer. If you mutate the growth hormone, or if you get a spontaneous dwarf, they all live longer. And we actually found out that over half of our centenarians have some mutation that affects this growth hormone pathway. And the reason I'm telling you that is, first, it's really more than any other thing that we see, but also because in this anti-aging field, growth hormone therapy is used, and I think it's dangerous.
There goes that question. Okay. Yes. No, I didn't mean to cut you off.
You have to stop me more, Max.
Okay. This is very important because you'll find a lot of snake oil salesmen and charlatans out there who are doing anti-aging, and one of the biggest ones is human growth hormone. And as Nir now sort of hinted at, it's a dangerous molecule. And so let's talk for just a second about this before we go on to some other things that I want to make sure we get to. And this, I don't know how many of you are familiar with what are called Laron dwarfs. Laron dwarfs, they're named after the Israeli scientists who first described them. They live in the mountains in Ecuador, I believe. And as you might imagine, they're little people. What's interesting about them, but there are a number of things that's interesting about them, is that they're relatively well proportioned as opposed to what we call achondroplastic dwarfs that have great big heads and big, short legs and things. They're relatively well proportioned, but they're obese. What would you say? They have sometimes 50% body fat. Right. They're obese. They have all things that you would normally think would doom them to a very short lifespan. But as was discovered when some scientists started studying them, very few of them get diabetes, very few of them get cancer, very few of them get heart disease. Maybe not, but cancer and diabetes, 2 big ones, they don't get it. And so they started looking, and why is that? Turns out they have a genetic mutation that they don't have a receptor for growth hormone. They have lots of growth hormone, unlike other dwarfs where you'd say, well, they're missing growth hormone, let's give them growth hormone and they grow. No, these guys are marinating in growth hormone, but their cells don't have a receptor for the growth hormone. So what's the implication of that when it comes to longevity or using that as an anti-aging
Right. So
drug.
I just want to tell you about a month ago, it was in the New York Times, so I know how to say it simply now, but we found deletion of exon 3 in the growth hormone receptor in our centenarians, 12% of our centenarians. But it took us a while to get a grip on it. And by the way, we did, and the reason is because they were taller. Okay, how do you have a mutation in the growth hormone receptor and you're taller? But what we did first is we validated this finding in 3 other populations. And it's all the same. In all those populations of centenarians or very old people, they had more of those deletions in the growth hormone receptors.
Deletions meaning they were missing.
They were missing that.
Okay.
But when we took them into our labs and tried to understand what's going on with the height, we found out something really interesting. When you just put the cells and see how much they're secreting IGF-1, which is the growth hormone really, that's the major growth hormone in our body. It's called IGF-1. They're not secreting a lot of it. Okay. But when you incubate them with growth hormone, rather than having the same, there's actually hyperactivation. So what happened when they go through puberty and have high growth hormone, they're growing even faster than others. But after that, when growth hormone goes down, they have very little of that. Okay, anyhow, what do we do with that?
So they got taller, but once they reached that height,
then growth hormone went.
Now they're essentially protected because
Exactly.
they're not
They have low growth hormone.
getting that growth hormone stimulation.
Right.
Okay.
So it's kind of interesting biology. We don't know what's the switch exactly, but I think we'll figure out soon. Okay, so so what do we do about it? So let me tell you what we've done and what we just, it's in review now. Amgen, as many as other pharmaceuticals, have been developing IGF receptor antibody. As I said, IGF is this peripheral growth hormone. They developed antibody against the receptor of IGF, not of growth hormone, of IGF, to treat cancer, okay? Because cancers have a lot of those receptors. And they failed. They tried in human trial. Not only they failed, other companies failed. The cancers are really smart. But they developed those antibodies. And those antibodies are just injections of once a week. So we took mice and we injected them with this for once a week, starting at 20 months old. So they're like 60, 70-year-old equivalent. And we increased their health span really dramatically. We stopped their aging, and we increased their lifespan also by 15%. And it was significant increase. So again, we find those genetic stuff, and we know what to do with it.
But so what bad stuff happens to someone who goes and gets human growth hormone injections for their anti-aging? They're a 50 or a 60 or 70-year-old and they want to keep living and they get these human growth hormone injections.
So I think I would say that the major risk is cancer.
Cancer.
Okay, but also diabetes, also a lot of issues. They get carpal tunnel. They get a lot of orthopedic issues as well. There must, why does it work? You know why it works? Because when you give growth hormone, it really takes fat away. So what happens? The face look better, and the muscle looks like they're more muscular. They actually don't change the muscle
Fat
function,
ratio or the muscle function.
muscle function,
No.
but the muscle look bigger. So that's why it works, because the problem with charlatans, some of them will say, take this drug, and you live forever. And if you die, nobody sues them, right? But with growth hormone, the success, $1 billion industry, is because you see something and you say, wow, this is really something. But you'll get cancer.
They look better for a while. They'll be a good-looking person in the casket. So we're talking drugs, and it turns out, I know I'm going to set Nir up for this one. Turns out there is a drug that may very well act as an anti-aging medication. And as I've said to other people, I will tell you what it is. If you pass a $100 bill up here, I'll write it on the back of the $100 bill.
Just a minute. Ask them if they know what it is.
Oh, well, there's a couple of ringers in the audience here, I know, but
I'm guessing, is it metformin?
that's it. Metformin is, and then now you can tell me in a second here how it works. Metformin is a generic, well-characterized, well-tolerated diabetes drug that's been around for 30, 40 years?
60 years.
60 years. NIR has now convinced the FDA to approve a clinical trial, the first ever, I believe, using a medication specifically targeting aging called the TAME trial, targeting aging with metformin, right? So now, my question is, how do we think that works? It's a diabetes drug. How does that work as an anti-aging medication?
So first of all, I don't think it's a diabetes drug. I think it fixes the aging part of diabetes. Okay? Mainly. It's more complicated, but let me stick to this hypothesis now. So the thing is, again, I'm just thinking not to bore you too much, but we know a lot of the biology of aging, and we know also where we have to hit in order to get better cells as we age. And those hits include something that's called mTOR. I'm just throwing it. It has to do with rapamycin, if you heard about this drug. It has to do with sirtuins, resveratrol, if you heard about it. And metformin acts on the mitochondria, and
those are the little energy plants inside of all of our cells, mitochondria.
Right, and that triggers a metabolic response that eventually hits those things that I mentioned to you. And so if you give metformin to nematodes, those are worms, and to mice and to rats, they would live longer and healthier. They actually live much more healthier than longer, which I kind of like. We want to expand healthspan rather than lifespan. But this is the nice thing about metformin, because it is 60 years around. We know a lot about it. We know through clinical studies, and when I say clinical studies, are control studies, where you took a group and you give a placebo or you give another treatment. We know that if you do a control study in people without diabetes, it'll prevent diabetes. We know that in people with diabetes, if you give them metformin compared to other treatment, they'll have 30% less cardiovascular disease. There's a lot of studies that are not clinical studies, but lots of association studies with cancers and with many kinds of cancers that decrease the incidence of cancer by 30%. There are 2 clinical studies on MCI, which is early Alzheimer's, where if you give metformin...
Mild cognitive impairment, by the way.
Right. That if you give metformin for between half a year to a year, you prevent some of the transit to Alzheimer's.
So it sounds like, though, that giving metformin activates or works on multiple pathways that we thought were so-called aging or anti-aging pathways?
Well, it works in the cell. So one of the problems with drug, when you ask mechanism of action of aging drug, it fixes a lot of things. So you never know how it started, okay? And that's a challenge, and that's how we know when people are telling me we found something that's important to aging. I put it in a cell, and I want to see how many things it fixed. If it didn't fix a lot of things, it's not really aging, it's something more specific. So it fixes a lot of things. Some of that it fixes because it fixes aging, and some of it because it does something, and we don't know which is first and which is second. I think I know with metformin, but I'm not sure.
And by the way, just so, because Nir mentioned nematodes, worms and mice and whatever, there's actually some very solid and interesting evidence about metformin in humans. We know that people without diabetes live longer than people with diabetes, right? If you give metformin to a diabetic, diabetics who take metformin live longer than people who don't have diabetes. Now think
Although
about
they're
that.
diabetic, although they're obese, although they're more sick to begin with, and it's 17% more, or 17% less mortality. It's not a joke.
So this is not a small thing. And there'll be a run on metformin at the pharmacy right after we're done
Still
here.
needs prescription.
I know a doctor. Part of what we're talking about is activating certain genes and genetic pathways, but in some ways, some of it is it's as important to suppress or turn off or turn down the volume on other genes that may be doing some bad things for us.
Yes, right. It changes. So some things will go down and some things will go up, and it depends how it's compared to young. It really fixes things, right? So
we talked about stem cells there, and that's kind of a whole different area in a sense. This idea that these old stem cells send out an SOS, the young stem cells hear it, and they respond with something that seems to rejuvenate them, which fundamentally it's got to be working at the genetic level anyway. So is another approach to anti-aging getting infusions of these placental stem cells, perhaps?
Absolutely. Not only placental, there are 2 papers this week on mesenchymal stem cells that were given to frail people and they got better. Okay? And
what kind of stem cell?
frail people, mesenchymal stem cells.
Mesenchymal,
So-
meaning these come from bone marrow generally? Yeah.
Right. Well, yeah.
I mean, but
Right.
it's a
but,
type of
right.
it's a
But
type
but
of
it
stem
happens.
cell.
Yeah, it happens also with the hematopoietic. But anyhow,
Mm-hmm.
stem cells. So let me though go to the chase. Okay, let me go to the chase. So regenerative medicine is, you saw it. There's a lot of promise here. But this is the problem if you think really far enough. You can replace all your neurons with neuronal stem cells. But if you do that, you're going to lose your memory in the process. So you're not going to be yourself, okay? So, okay, that doesn't mean, if you want to be immortal, that doesn't mean it's not a way to go. But then you really have to plan how you download your memories, put stem cells, and then load them with your memories. Okay, I'm just telling you, the stem cell is a very good tool, and I think we'll use it more and more for indications. But for me, it's still beyond reaching to one. You know, average maximum lifespan is about 115. I think we can get there. Metformin is a weak drug. We have better drugs coming. We just have to get the indication and combination of drugs, okay? We'll get there. After 115, it gives us 35 years more to work on making it really, you know, not losing anything in the way that you wanted to get there, right?
But at that point, stuff just wears out. I mean, we may still be relatively healthy, but I suspect our knees will be metal and plastic by that point. Same thing with our hips, shoulders, and a few other things. Stuff is just going to
and we'll
wear
probably
out.
keep on having some bionic intervention.
And that's not really anti-aging per se, but you know, there's a lot of investigation in using stem cells to regrow and regenerate organs that so we'll have hearts and kidneys and livers off the shelf, which is not, you know, a license to drink too much tonight. There is, and you mentioned it earlier, but I want to make sure people make the connection between what Nir said as probably the single strongest non-pharmaceutical anti-aging thing we can do is, you said, exercise.
Right, and what metformin is doing in activation of AMP kinase is what exercise is doing. So there's a lot of pathways that are relevant. But if you exercise, you're more likely to get over the age of 80, okay? If you're asking what it takes to be 100 or 115, I think we need
Something else.
Something else.
I'll buy that. Should we take some questions?
Is it true that women live longer than men? My mother was in a nursing home, and they had a plaque up for every person that was a centenarian, and there were 50 names, 49 were women, and 1 was a man.
Yeah. Well, first of all, the answer is yes, and it's absolutely incredible because we're talking about 2-3 years longer. Okay, it's absolutely incredible, and in the last years only we started to understand the gender, the sex effects on longevity. And some of the drugs that we're using in the lab are better for males and some for females. By the way, most of the growth hormone story, except the growth hormone receptor story, is correct for females more than for males. So women live longer. It's fascinating. I think there will be drugs that are better for men and women. But on a humorous side, I just want to tell you that when in my culture, when they ask why do husbands die before their wives, we say because they want to. Just kidding.
That was near Barzilai who said that, not Max Gomez, by the way, when you repeat that joke later on. But one quick thing to mention about this, because when I was doing the story on the super centenarians, and they're 115 years old, there is a selection bias also that's involved in why women live longer. Because if you think of someone who's been alive for 115 years, they've been through a lot of wars. We've had a lot of wars. Up until just recently, who went to war and got killed? Men. So we took a lot of men out of that potential population that might have lived longer. So that's what we call a selection bias.
So out of every 100 centenarians, 85 are women in the world. But actually, over the age of 85, the men suffers like mostly at early age and then 50 to 75. After that, their mortality is the same actually. So if you get there.
Yes, sir. Thank you for a very interesting presentation.
Thanks.
Two-part question, if I may. What is the dosage regimen that you're using in your clinical study for metformin? And the second question is, roughly 30% of the adult population in the United States is either diabetic or pre-diabetic. So for individuals who are already pre-diabetic, would it make sense just to go on a dosage of metformin?
Yeah. So the first question is 750 milligrams twice a day. I'm sure you just wanted to know for the study. So that's the answer.
It's an intellectual curiosity.
Okay, the prediabetes. So let me say the prediabetes is an example of why we need the FDA. This diabetes prevention trial that really showed that metformin delays diabetes.
That's not this trial, not the aging trial.
No,
That's a
no,
different
it's the trial that one of the trials that was done in metformin. Right. So we know it works already. So they got a 30% decrease in diabetes. So let me ask you, and I'm hoping you'll say it wrong, so don't think too much. But how many people pre-diabetic in the United States you think are on metformin?
So I'll say maybe 25%.
So only 3%. Okay? And the reason is the FDA, the scientists didn't go to the FDA to approve it. So the FDA never approved prediabetes, and the doctors are conservative. They're not going to prescribe something just based on knowledge if the FDA doesn't approve that. And that shows you...
It would be an off-label use of metformin.
Right, it's off-label. Any doctor can give it, and some endocrinologists do, but it's an underutilized drug, significantly for what we know already. And that's why it's very important for us to go to FDA and open this aging field so that pharmaceuticals can jump in and develop better drugs and combination of drugs so we can start delaying this aging significant now.
Yes, sir. We have microphone up front.
Daniel decides.
There are all kinds of exercise from bodybuilding to swimming to mountain climbing. What do you mean by a good exercise?
Well, I I don't know enough to answer that, and it's a very difficult question. By the way, mountain climbing, I don't know. I'm not going to do that. But there's a lot of debate. I can tell you one thing, that the combination is better. In other words, it's not only aerobic. You have to do other combination when you're getting older in order to get the benefit. But there's a lot of controversial too. You know, in aging, one thing, too much and too little are not good, okay? So you cannot overdo things because we're in a delicate balance. But we have to do something.
You're looking for that Goldilocks amount of exercise. I actually do know a little bit about this based on what Bob Hariri had told me. He found that the best exercise for anti-aging is the exercise you'll actually do. No, and that sounds sort of a little flip, but it's not, because if I tell you that the best thing to do is, you know, overhead military presses, you'll go do that, and after a while you'll say, you know, this is really, I don't want to do this anymore, and you won't do it. So it's whatever you'll do. That said, he found that where they did some studies measuring different types of exercise in different people and different kinds of, and then measuring their stem cell mobilization, found that the stem cell mobilization was weightlifting, resistance training. You don't have to be, you know, Arnold Schwarzenegger. And he found that lower body, because you have the most muscle mass really in your lower body, seemed to mobilize the most. But it's whatever you'll do that's what will make the best, most difference. Yes.
Thank you so much for this very interesting discussion. Obviously, you agree that aging is a disease, as metformin is medication, is a medication. Now, why it took so long for the FDA to approve of this clinical trial, number one? And the second question is, how optimistic are you? And how far are we actually for curing the disease of aging?
So I want to tell you
Not the diseases of aging.
I want to tell you
Thank
something. We're very careful. We, the geroscientists, and also the FDA, we're very careful not calling aging a disease. First of all, not everybody is sick when they age. Second, there's ageism. You don't want to say, oh, you look like you're, you know, going to the pharmacy, okay? We're trying not to call aging a disease. And part of the discussion with the FDA is what will we call something that everybody will know that it's aging? And the answer was a composite of age-related diseases, okay? So we're not calling aging a disease, and so I don't want to let it pass by saying you obviously think that aging is a disease, okay? Why? So you're asking why did it take so much time to do? You know what happened? Only in the last few years we went from hope to promise. Okay, when we said, you know, we understand there's a biology of aging, and we get here those and stuff data. It's only the body of evidence has been overwhelming only recently. And that's the turning point, and that's what we're trying to do now, to use it and say there, you know, we did better than the preclinical studies in cancer field or in cardiovascular disease. So it's time for us to move on, and we're doing it like that in all fronts.
And it's not just, by the way, in aging, which, as Nir alludes to here. One of the things that we talk about, for example, in the book, is that we've reached a critical mass of knowledge, of information about whether it's genetics and drugs and what are the mechanisms of aging, mechanisms of disease, to where we've hit this, as Malcolm Gladwell would call it, a tipping point. Or as Vice President Biden said at the last Vatican conference that you know, Nir and I have been at several of them now, he called it an inflection point in the history of mankind, that we are that close to really making a significant difference in being able to do something, whether you call it treating or curing, some of the most difficult diseases of mankind, and whether you call aging a disease or not, that I don't want to argue with Nir on that, because I'm going to lose. it's a tipping point. We get to a critical mass of knowledge and information, and I think that's what has led the FDA to finally say, you know, maybe there is enough here that we can now approve. They're very conservative when it comes to giving drugs to apparently healthy people.
And you know, we use metformin as a tool because, by the way, with the FDA, we never talked about metformin. It's all in their website. Whatever you want to know about metformin, we're talking about repurposing of a drug, okay? And we were a bunch of scientists. There was no pharmaceuticals with us, so it was
Pharma, you mean drug companies?
Right, drug companies. So it was really an opportunity to enter that and really make them understand that the science is there and we have to show that we can do it.
How about somebody in the back where, oh, there you go. All right, go ahead.
Sorry. So my uncle did that Earth's Elders project where the minimum age was 110. And I remember him telling me that there was a village of something like 300 people in Japan where the second oldest person who's ever lived to 123 or so was from. And there was the oldest woman in the world at that time. I think she was 116. And so this idea of location, are there locations in the world where people live a very long time, and are they being studied?
First of all, you know, it's a good question, but I have to tell you, for 90 years old, you look really good.
Was your uncle, yeah, Jerry. Oh, no kidding. Tell him I said hi. Is he still out in the Far East? Yeah, okay.
So there, do you want to talk about it?
Well, part of that is true, but what Jerry, in his book, Earth's Elders, and this is a fascinating book, he's a professional photographer, and he took these amazing portraits of these super centenarians, and they're really—
It's in my office.
When you're really moving, and while there are these pockets of super centenarians in there, there were also a handful of them. There was one guy I remember who had a turban and a jewel in the middle of his forehead and a big beard. And I'm reading through it, and the guy lived on West 57th Street over here somewhere in New York City, really. So there is some of that. It's not as big a difference as some of us would think.
But you know, I want to just generally say there's this blue zone thing, right? That there are those islands of Greek and some other places where people live long because they have the best olive oil and they exercise and stuff like that. And Sardinia, I think
Guam,
it's
I think,
actually
is another
old.
one, right? Guam, I think, has a very high incidence.
I'm not sure.
Anyway.
Okinawa.
That's what I'm thinking, I'm sorry.
Okinawa is the highest in
Yes,
the world.
yes.
And so I actually think it's all genetics. I think in Sardinia, they all are from 3 villages in Sardinia, and there's no longevity in others. And so I think there's intermarriage or interrelationship or other things that happen. And I think you really don't get there with help. Japan is, in Japan, people live the longest. It's a combination of genetic and environment, I think. And in Okinawa, they even live the longest. And again, it has to be some probably combination. So you start with another genetic background and you add to that some vegetables and fish and it explains. And olive oil. Well, not in Japan.
Well, no, okay. There were some folks in the back, I think? No? There's somebody way back in there.
I wanted to ask you about what do you think of epigenetic factors, and also what receptors are being targeted? What type of receptors with anti-aging drugs? And
What was the last part again?
what receptors, types of receptors, are being targeted?
Or what receptors are targeted? Okay. But what was your first question? I'm sorry.
Epigenetics.
Yeah. Thanks for asking that. Epigenetics is really a major mechanism for aging. Okay, and why and how I don't think I can explain, but I'll give you an example. There is a guy. Are you an epigeneticist? So you know Horvath, or you heard about Horvath. So Steve Horvath from UCLA has set up 365 epigenetics. So epigenetics is changes on top of the genome, okay? So it's not the sequence, but all of a sudden something sits on the DNA and says don't work or work more, okay?
The DNA itself is the same.
Is the same.
It's stuff that,
Right.
that sits on top
That
of it
sits on
that
top.
either blocks it or
Right.
turns it loose. or
And,
something.
and with aging, you get some more methylation, some less methylation. There's some other mechanisms of doing that. I really don't think it's appropriate to do more, but Steve Horvath found 360 epigenetic changes that will correlate very well with chronological age, but most important with biological age. And so, and he calls it the clock, the epigenetic clock. So I think you'll hear more about epigenetics. We're certainly doing a lot of epigenetics in our studies, especially because we have centenarians and their offspring, so we can see which epigenetics has been inherited and which has been acquired, and it's a very important mechanism, and thanks for mentioning that. Oh, the receptor, I said IGF receptor antibody, for example, is being tried. There, I don't know off the top of my head other receptors.
So in your talk, you really differentiated between drugs and treatments that target aging itself versus something more particular like cardiovascular disease. And that question came up that aging is a disease and not a diseases of aging. So I'm having a hard time understanding that, because to me, aging is a multi-dimensional, multicellular process. So when you say something like it fixes specifically aging, are you saying drugs that would target like programmed cell death or clearing senescent cells or something related to telomeres? So just differentiate what you mean by sort of fixing aging.
Ringers are in the audience here.
Yeah, you mentioned three important, you're calling our bluff a little bit. You mentioned three important pathways in aging, and maybe I'll pick one of them just to say, and that's senescent cells, okay?
These are old cells that have sort of stopped dividing.
Yeah,
Okay.
so our cells, if they run into problem, okay, if things are not going well, if there are mutations that we acquired, they can either do apoptosis, which means they commit suicide and said, we're out of here, okay? Or they go another pathway that's called senescence. They basically become old, okay? It's a mechanism to protect against cancer. When old people have a lot of senescent cells, but what we've discovered recently, those senescent cells are not only protecting us from cancer, but they themselves secrete lots of stuff like inflammatory peptides that are actually adding to the aging and not in a very good way. So when you remove it by genetic method, all of a sudden those mice are happy and young again. So senescent therapy is going to be when I said other drugs in combination, senolytic, that's how we talk, is the hot stuff, okay? We are all concentrating now on finding senolytic drugs, and I think we can take old people, for example, before they go surgery in sometime and give them senolytic drugs and see that they're actually doing better after that. So I'm sorry I took this one, but thank you very much. Everything you mentioned is for the course, not for the hour.
And there's a lot of research into all of these different pathways, especially senescence is one that I know there's a lot of work on.
Maybe I should just say, I don't think telomeres are causing aging, okay? They're
Wait, do we know what telomeres are?
Tell them.
All right. Telomeres, you know what the little plastic caps are on the end of your shoelaces? There's a name for them, and I never remember what they're, is actually, what is it?
Aglet,
Ag-
A-G-L-E-T.
Aglet.
Oh, I thought they're called telomeres.
That's a scientist talking. So the little plastic caps keep the ends of the shoelaces from fraying. Telomeres act sort of similar. They are a repeating sequence of DNA, right? Correct me if I wander off the reservation here, that protect the functional part of the chromosome, right? As a cell continues to divide, these telomeres get shorter. They are sort of giving up parts of themselves to kind of protect the rest of the chromosome. That's kind of the biological clock, is what people call it. So that if you have short telomeres on your chromosomes, it's said that those chromosomes are biologically older. If you have longer telomeres, it said that those cells are younger. So you want long telomeres, right? Because you want your cells to be younger. Well, no, not necessarily, because that implies that those cells may continue to divide. If they get too short, finally the cell becomes senescent, it stops dividing. If they're long, the cell can keep dividing. If a cell can keep dividing and dividing, what is that?
Cancer.
That's cancer, exactly. So you don't want, as we were talking before, you don't want too much exercise, you don't want too little exercise, you don't want telomeres that are too long or too short, you want the Goldilocks length, and the problem is we don't know what the Goldilocks length is for telomeres. And good news, bad news is there is an enzyme called telomerase that lengthens your telomeres. And there are different things that purport to increase the activity of telomerase so that you can lengthen your telomeres. I'm not sure that anybody's actually demonstrated that that it actually has any real impact on
No,
on aging
and
or
when you do it
diseases.
in mice, they get cancer, unless you knock out some other stuff. But
And by the way, there are companies, and we did this story, you can send off a sample, a blood sample, they'll measure your telomere length and tell you whether your cells are younger or older than your calendar age. I happen to be a little bit younger than my calendar age, not a lot, but a couple of years younger than my calendar age. So that's the telomere part of the story that I think was that's part of the genetics. Last question, who's
Are there side effects or risk associated with metformin? Side effects or risk associated with taking metformin?
well, the only thing is that there are two things. Everybody who's starting on metformin feels it. You get sometimes diarrhea, upset stomach, bitter taste in the mouth, and it goes away after a week. If the diarrhea doesn't go away after a week, which happens to 3% of the people, they shouldn't be on metformin. And that's it.
I've heard for decades about all these studies that in theory might improve longevity, and they're always being studied, and nothing's ever released that I can get without being part of a clinical trial. I always figured, the day after I die or get frozen, that's when it'll be released. Besides metformin, is there anything out there or soon to be out there? Because this is all pie in the sky,
So first of all, I have to be the responsible guy here. I'm an MD, okay, and I'm telling you that I'm reluctant to say anything without clinical studies. That's why we're doing TAME. It's not that I'm not sure what the results are, but we have to do the clinical studies. And so the answer for you is there's nothing on a clinical studies that I can tell you now, but I can. But what do you want?
But our kids will be very happy.
I don't think our kids. I think that we'll be able the next decade. It's what Ron Howard, look at his program, The Breakthrough. I think the next decade will start making real progress with aging. It's just going to happen, and it will also happen with your help, because it's very important for you to know the story. Not all the scientists know the story. Some scientists are in their own silos. They do cancer, they do diabetes. You come and say aging, they don't know anything. They said it's probably nonsense, but it's not. And we need everybody. We need the FDA. We went to the Senate. We want people to be informed. Max and his friends are doing a good job for us, but we can do it. It's not science fiction. It's science now.
Dr. Nir Barzilai, ladies and gentlemen.
Max Gomez.